So of course you're going to need a sewing machine, and it will need to have a free motion foot. You will either have a foot that belongs to your machine, or you might be able to find a universal free motion foot to fit. If you're unsure, check the manual or maybe contact the manufacturer. Look at their website, see if you can get something specific for your machine. And then you'll need your usual sewing equipment. You'll need scissors, needles, pins, all that sort of thing. Quilting clips are really useful. I use little mini ones. I've got a jam jar of those. I use those all the time. For our base, we're going to need canvas or firm calico, at least 1 metre to start with. You may need more, it depends how many samples you stitch. And it has to be firm. So I use a canvas, the sort of thing that you could then prime and paint on, so painter's canvas, or a firm calico. It has to be firm, it cannot be floppy, because you will just get so much distortion as you start to stitch. So we will get some distortion no matter what we do, it's the nature of the beast, but to make it easier we need to make our base as rigid as possible, whilst obviously still being able to stitch through it. So canvas does the job, as does firm calico. And you will need an embroidery stabilizer as well. This adds another layer of stability, and I like to cut it bigger than my piece of work, so that gives me somewhere to hold and also somewhere to start and finish all my stitching. I use something like Stitch and Tear or Madeira Cotton Soft or something similar to that, and again you'll need at least 1 metre. The ones I like using are stiff and papery. They do not have to be fusible. We literally just put it beneath our work and start to stitch. You may or you may not tear it away at the end. We'll get onto that at the end of the course. But you will need a fusible webbing, and by that I mean one of these iron-on adhesives, double-sided adhesive. The one I like to use is called Bondaweb or Vlysofix, and you'll need at least a fat quarter, or again another metre. It comes in different widths. You can buy it in little packets, you can even buy it in little ribbons, but we need a big chunk, a nice big chunk of it. I use this a lot, so if I find a good price for it somewhere, I tend to buy a few metres at a time. It doesn't like being kept for too long. It will start to separate from its backing paper, so you need to keep it in a cool or dark place. Don't keep it in direct sun, that doesn't help it either. And you need to use it, and we will be using it. And because we're using a fusible iron-on adhesive, we're going to need some baking parchment or silicone sheet, or both. I use both, which will help protect your ironing surface and your iron, because no matter how careful we are, the glue does sometimes seep out from the edges, and it's a real pig to get off the base of your iron if you get it on there. So you will be needing an iron and an ironing pad. And then it's good to have a notebook or a folder somewhere where you can store any handouts that you print out or your own written notes. It's also useful to keep smaller stitch experiments and samples with your notes, just so that you can remember what you did and how, and you can jot down ideas that you have while you're doing it for future projects and experiments. That's your basic kit, if you like. That's the very basic things that you will need. And then for your design work, you're going to need either a sketchbook, not too small, it needs to be big enough for you to actually work in. We're not doing little thumbnail things. Well, I mean, we are, but we might want some bigger pages as well. And if you don't have a suitable sketchbook, you could use paper, you could use loose paper. You just need somewhere where you can trial design ideas. It could be the same book as the one you use for your notes, in which case maybe use blank paper, or it could be loose sheets of paper. I don't really mind, it's whatever works best for you. I would recommend that it isn't too precious or expensive, because you need to be able to feel that you can dive in and start using it, rather than being scared of that white page. And then the usual pencil case stuff, things like a pen to write with, a pencil, an eraser, a ruler. And then we will be using a little bit of watercolour paint. I use a palette of Koh-i-Noor dyes, they're called. There's just very, very strong water-based paints. You could use a kid's watercolour palette. It really doesn't matter, but just some sort of water-based paint. And with that you'll need some brushes and a water jar, and probably a table protector as well, something to protect your table from paint. So it could be an oilcloth, a plastic tablecloth, or just some old newspapers. And then fun things like felt pens, markers, ordinary kids felt pens, colouring pens, pencils, all that sort of stuff, and also a glue stick or just some ordinary white school glue and a glue spreader. So for our backgrounds we're going to need some white paint, and it needs to be a sort of white paint that we can paint over, that we can add more colour onto. So I like to use an artist's gesso, and the one I use is not expensive at all. And you could use a gouache as well, which also has a matte surface. It allows you to paint on top. And a pinch, you could use a tester pot of household emulsion, and we're going to water it down anyway, so you don't need to spend a lot of money. You don't need very much of it. You just need some sort of white paint that you can then paint over with the watercolours. And then once we've done that, we're going to want to seal it so that the paint doesn't just rub off as we're working. I sometimes use an acrylic wax. It's like a water-based wax, or rather it washes out with water. Or you could use matte medium, which should be easy to find. Not a matte gel, that's too thick, something a little bit more fluid. At a pinch you could use some PVA, some white school glue, although it will dry quite shiny. But then again, we're going to be adding fabrics onto the top of it, so it shouldn't matter too much. If that's all you've got, that's all you've got. And then this is where we really get into the nitty-gritty of the materials. This is where all the fun stuff is. For our collage, we're going to need a huge variety of papers. Anything goes. Use your favourites. I like using old sheet music or book pages. I like using old maps, sometimes some junk mail, gift wrap, whatever it is that you've got to hand. And then for our swirls, we're going to need a variety of fabrics. I think it's better to have a wider variety of lots of different fabrics, even if it's in very tiny amounts, than to have lots and lots of one or two fabrics. Because with the swirls of colour, the idea is to play with the colour, to play with the contrast, the patterns. So the more we have in our palette of fabrics, if you like, the better the scope of what we can do. But use what you have. Remnants, scraps, everything is fair game. You can use dressmaking offcuts. If you know someone who's into dressmaking, get all their scraps. You can use recycled fabric from clothes, whatever you have in your stash, as long as it's reasonably lightweight. We're not using thick fabrics like denim or corduroy. We want to be able to layer, so lightweight, dressmaking weight, cotton fabrics are good, but it doesn't have to be cotton either. Any fabric really. Old scarves, pieces of silk, lace, ribbons, although actually ribbons can be a little bit tricky to use sometimes. You'd be surprised. So it doesn't matter how big they are or how small they are. Anything goes really. We can stretch things with the way that we cut them and how we piece them together. You'll also need some pieces of organza or chiffon, whether this is old scarves which you can then layer up to introduce some more colour without obliterating everything that's underneath. If you have some sheer colours, that's fun. But also you'll need a piece of natural coloured or white organza, because we're going to do something very specific with that. It doesn't have to be a very big piece, even if it's just the size of an A4 piece of paper. That would be perfect. So some white organza. And then of course we're going to need all the threads. So we'll need sewing machine threads, so all-purpose polyester threads, as well as the fancier machine embroidery threads, the metallic threads, whatever threads you have, whatever threads take your fancy. The better brands will work better because they're a better quality. They'll be less likely to shred and to break. And if you tend to use cheaper brands of embroidery thread or unbranded embroidery thread, they will be more delicate, they won't be as well made, they are more likely to break. Also, threads get old, they get brittle, they like to be used. So use what you have already, and if you do need to go shopping for new threads, try and get a good brand, by which I mean Sulky or Superior, Madeira, Gutermann. A brand that you've heard of will be a good brand. If you come across something that I haven't heard of or no one else has heard of, then that's a bit of an indication that maybe it wouldn't be such good quality. I can't really recommend brands because I don't know what's available where you live. Buy the best quality threads that you can find and that you can afford, because this is the business end of things, if you like. This is sort of make or break, almost quite literally in some cases, for any stitching project. It doesn't really matter quite so much what we're stitching, so like the fabric or the paper, as what we're stitching with, the thread. It's the thread that holds it all together, so the thread is where you should put your money if you're going to invest in any materials for this project. And then we will need some hand embroidery threads, and for this absolutely anything goes. As well as hand embroidery threads, we can also use those novelty yarns, things that have got sparkle or bobbles or whatever. Anything goes. We can use it in some way in this course. And for finishing off, you're going to need all those oddments and trimmings, beads and buttons, lace, decorative edges, ric-rac, sequins, all that sort of thing. Again, anything goes, whatever takes your fancy. And with some of our embellishments, we might need a little dab of a strong glue. So there's a tacky glue that I use, which can be very useful just for securing the heavier things, like bigger pieces of metal work, things like washers or bigger, heavier buttons. I will also always try and stitch things down, but a little bit of glue gives peace of mind for making sure that things stay where we want them. For later on, when we're finishing our work, we might also want a fabric glue, like a clear solvent-based glue, like Yoo-hoo or something like that. I also like to use invisible thread. It's really useful for all sorts of things, so I would highly recommend that you get yourself a reel of monofilament invisible thread. And again, a good brand like a Madeira or a Gutermann will see you well. And a cocktail stick can be very useful for things like placing sequins, and it saves using your fingers, which never tends to work very well for obvious reasons. And then when it comes to finishing our work, to framing our swirls at the end, we'll talk nearer the time about what we might need for that, because that all depends on how you want to finish or frame your work. So I haven't included anything for framing in this list of requirements here.